On today's episode, we are joined by Canadian research professor Dr. Stephen Cooke to answer the age-old question, does pouring Cooke or Mountain Dew on a bleeding fish really help? And lucky for us, Dr. Cooke has published seemingly one of the only true scientific research studies done to date on the topic, and he has answers. Does it matter what type of pop you use? Does the temperature matter? Does species matter? Does it even help at all? Or worse, does it do just the opposite? All of that and more on this episode of Tackle Talk.
Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Dance, and you're listening to Tackle Talk.
This is the Tackle Talk Podcast, brought to you by American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors, Mossy Oak, and Dakota Lithium.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another very, very cool episode of the Tackle Talk Podcast. I'm so excited to get to this episode, and we will get to all of the good stuff in just a second. But first, we have to thank the company that makes this entire show possible, the incredible folks over at American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. And if you take one thing away from this intro, it's that you should be subscribed to American Legacy Fishing's emails and text alerts. Why? Well, because today at 11:50 a.m., I got a text from American Legacy Fishing that simply said, flash sale, 48 hours only, 40% off all in-stock Fenwick world-class rods. These world-class rods typically are in the $420 to $450 price range, but right now they're like $250. That's a savings of about $200 per rod, which is huge, all because I signed up to their text alerts. So if you want to get $200 savings text alerts sent right to your phone, make sure you sign up for their rewards program, or better yet, become an American Legacy Elite member to get not only these great sales, but you get free shipping on all of your orders. You get 10% back on all of your orders, access to their private Facebook group for even more sales and deals, and a huge laundry list of other benefits. All of that from the best in the business, American Legacy Fishing and Outdoors. New gear, used gear, rods, reels, line, baits, whatever you need, they've got you covered. www.americanlegacyfishing.com. And as always, be sure to use code TACKLETALK10 at checkout for even more savings. All right, everybody, today's episode is why so many of you choose to listen to this show, because we're going to do what most shows would not do right now. While everybody else in the fishing world is melting down about forward-facing sonar, or the long list of rule changes from the 3 big circuits in the past week, or Bassmaster's information rule reversal, or whatever, we are not going to do that. In fact, we're going to do almost the complete opposite of all of that and have what I think is one of the coolest episodes that we've had in a while, as we get the chance to sit down and chat with an extremely well-respected researcher and biologist from Ottawa, Canada, to dissect his recent study on the effects of carbonated beverages on flesh wounds of fish. Now, we've all heard the stories before or seen the videos and been told for years that one of the biggest hacks, and I'm doing hacks in air quotes right here if you could see me, in fishing is if you gut hook a fish or hook a fish in the gills or the tongue patch or whatever and it starts bleeding, the best thing you can do is pour some Mountain Dew on it or pour Coke on it or whatever, and bam, that fish stops bleeding. Congratulations, you've saved that fish's life because of some TikTok that you watched one time or something that you heard from your great-granddad or from your friends or something. Well, it's one thing to hear about it on the internet, it's another thing to do a scientific research study on the topic with controls and variables and a large enough sample size to prove or disprove the theory. And that's exactly what Dr. Stephen Cooke and his team did in this particular study. So instead of hearing me trying to explain their study and all of their findings, I figured it would be best to hear it straight from the man himself, and that's exactly what we have for you today. Dr. Cooke was kind enough to sit down with us, again, all the way from Ottawa, Canada, to walk us through their study from start to finish and help us better understand whether there truly is something in soda that can help a bleeding fish have a better chance of survival, or if it's nothing more than an old wives' tale. So with that, let's jump right into this information-packed conversation with Dr. Stephen Cooke. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are joined today by Dr. Stephen Cooke. First and foremost, I want to thank you for joining us today. I know you have a busy schedule. Thanks for stopping by Tackle Talk.
No problem. This will be fun.
So to fill the listeners in, I'm going to try and go through your current positions and stuff right now. You can give me a grade at the end of this on how well I do in terms of your credentials here. So I've got research professor in environmental science and biology at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, editor-in-chief of the publication Fisheries, which a lot of us are familiar with, which is produced by the American Fisheries Association, director of the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation, co-editor-in-chief of the Environmental Evidence Journal. We have editor and strategic advisor of the Conservation Physiology Journal, I believe. And then you're a fellow, obviously, at the Royal Society of Canada, Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and then the American Fisheries Society. So A through F, how do we do there?
Yeah, you missed the important stuff, like I'm an avid angler and a father of 3 young boys, and that stuff. And for folks that don't, you said Ottawa, Canada, so up here in the far north, but we do have summer. We do get to fish for bass and muskie and all that good stuff. It's we don't have snow year round, thankfully.
So I guess before we start here, it is important to back up. One of the things that we love is when we get the chance to talk with researchers and, people that are in positions of more the educational side of things. It is important to have some sort of angling background, because we've had conversations before where it is just tough, I think, for some people in your position to relate it to regular everyday anglers, because you're just, you're dealing with academics and you're dealing with all of these people all day long. And then to be able to relate it to us, again, just guys that like to go out, like to fish, and like to use this information on the weekend or whatever to help us out on the water, I think is very important. So let's start with your angling background. How long have you been angling? How long has that been one of your hobbies? And how did, I guess, that kind of lead you into more like the educational side of things?
Yeah, so it all started with inheriting a tackle box when I was 6 or 7 years old, starting to fish local ponds and rivers, and watching TV shows. Back in the day, it was a Canadian fishing celebrity named Bob Izumi, which some of your listeners may have heard of. And at some point, I was like, you know what? I want to be some kind of environmental professional, a fisheries manager or something on a local lake. So went off to university, and during university, I had an opportunity to work for a PhD student, and I got hooked on research. And what I like about research, it's kind of like fishing. Fishing in many ways it's about trying to solve mysteries, right? Where are the fish and how do I catch them? And fishery science is sort of the same, it's trying to solve mysteries. What do fish eat? Where do they go? What are their key habitats? And the same struggles that anglers have, we as scientists also have. Our gear is imperfect. When you try to combine technology with water, things always go wrong. Weather gets in the way. Even though we've got access to nets and electricity and all sorts of other gadgets, we sometimes struggle to catch the fish as well. So to me, science and fishing are pretty similar.
What about the actual fishing side of things? Like, what is your favorite target species? What are you as an angler out there liking to go out and do? Are you a river guy, a lake guy? You guys have a little bit of everything up there. And I think everything that I've heard of Canada is like it is the promised land that I think as a kid in Southern Ohio, we just like dream of. So I'm a little jealous, and I want to vicariously live through you for a second. What is your fishing life up there?
Yeah, I'm certainly really into the slop. So I love to get up in the thick, nasty weeds and try and find largemouth in 6 inches of water. There's something sort of up close and personal about that kind of fishing that I really like. And you make really good connections between the fish and the habitat they're using. So I like that. Certainly love fishing smallmouths. Not into walleye so much. Walleye are sort of walleye bore me a little bit, to be honest.
Reeling in a wet paper bag. Yeah.
Love to eat them, but and then because I live in Canada and I'm not super keen on ice fishing, not my thing to sit in a tent. I'd rather go skiing. But I try to take off to warmer places in the winter. So I also really love bone fishing. And bonefish are another one of those fish that you get up really close and personal with. You're usually not blind casting. You watch the fish sort of, stalk your fly or your jig, whatever you happen to be using. And so, I like to see that kind of action. So, few of my faves.
That's cool because kind of the way I grew up fishing and still love to fish and have a soft spot for it being in Southern Ohio, we're in farm country. So it's like farm creeks, little, 1 foot, 2 foot deep farm creeks that people drive over on their way to work every day and don't think anything of it that they would have fish in them, let alone good fish. And you get in and you are, knee deep, hip deep, chest deep in water, and you're right in the ecosystem with the fish. So I think I've learned more in my life by just wet wading small creeks than I have in any other way of fishing, because you see up close how those fish relate to structure, how they relate to current breaks and all these type of things, how sensitive they are in terms of how skittish certain fish are going to be in certain situations and how far you need to cast away to still be in the strike zone without those fish being alerted that you're coming from downstream. And there's just so much that you can learn from small water. So that's kind of like our version of you getting in the slop in a couple foot of water. So that's definitely cool that you're a small water guy.
It's the shallows too. And being a fish biologist, fishery scientist, whatever you want to call me, sometimes I'm called a marine biologist. I'll just roll with it, even though marine implies saltwater. And I do fresh and salt, but they'll often assume I'm a mega scuba diver. Oh, you must do lots of great diving. And I've been scuba diving twice in my life. All the cool stuff, from my perspective, happens in a couple feet of water. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about, marine systems or fresh water. It's that littoral area, the nearshore area of lakes, up close in the mangroves, down in the Florida Keys, the nearshore patch reefs. That's where the cool stuff happens. So I do tons of snorkeling, but not much scuba.
So then you transition into the academics side of things, and I might get this wrong, but when I saw your article for the first time, we'll get to in a second. Obviously, the point of this episode is one of the specific research papers that you were a part of. But when I was researching that, and then I went snooping a little bit on, the people that were a part of that study, I think I read something that back in the day when you were at one of the universities, you came across a publication of fisheries. And that was like one of the first things that I think kind of lit that spark in you of like, okay, maybe I'd like to, I know I want to research, but maybe I do want to go down this fish side of things. And there is a way to do that and be a little bit more scholarly and academic. So was that article or that magazine, I guess, of fisheries that you found in that library, was that the catalyst that kind of sent you down this road?
Yeah, there were a couple of things coming together, but that was definitely a part of it. I think it was finding that and then getting connected with that grad student that sort of took me under his wing and connected me with research. So it's one thing to read a paper and be like, wow, there's people that study this stuff and you can make a career out of this. And then sort of parlaying that into, oh, I guess I need to do grad school. What's grad school about? Who are these mythical grad students? And what's this research, and who are these professor types that are around here? So but it was University of Waterloo in the stacks in the basement where all back in the day when things weren't electronic, they would display all of them. And there was one that had a fish on the not many journals actually have something interesting on the cover. Usually it's some line art, the black and white, and there's some brilliant colored fish, and I just headed right for it. And wow, there's one of these every month. This is amazing. And now I'm the editor of that publication, which is things come full circle. Pretty cool.
And then to give people some perspective, so the website that I use to read a lot of the articles and the research papers that I like to kind of peruse out there is ResearchGate. And on ResearchGate, when you have an author or someone that's part of a study, you can click on them and then it will tell you like how many publications they've been a part of and citations and number of reads and things like that. When you click on your name, I mean, this was like the first thing I clicked. I was like, oh my goodness. Like it was something like 1,400 publications just on that website alone that you were listed as a part of. It was like 58,000 citations and like 600,000, reads and views on your papers and stuff. So a lot of times when we have people on, obviously you'll do that same thing. And they've been a part of, a handful of studies here or there. It looks like you're a part of like 4, 5, 6, 7 a month on there. So how do you pack that much volume and that much research into? And you're not an old guy, right? You're still relatively young. You're not some Gandalf looking, guy that's been around for 100 years. You're, I don't know, I'm going to guess mid 40s. Like, how have you been able to pack that much into your career so far?
Yeah, I've always liked to write and been pretty good at it. A lot of people have writer's block. And when you do science, you need to tell the stories. If you do a study and it doesn't get recorded, the only person that knows about it is you. And oftentimes our research is paid for by government, tax dollars, by industry partners, and so on. And we owe it to them to share the work we do. I like collaborating with people. You're not going to see many Steve Cooke papers with just my name on it. Oftentimes there's 5, 10, 20 other people. Some of those may be anglers from a local fishing club. They may be government fisheries managers. They may be students from a number of different universities and so on. So I like building teams and doing things. But yeah, I like writing too. That's my sort of creative outlet. If it's not fishing, it's I'm okay in the kitchen as well. But writing, scientific writing, I think one can be creative. And science is the foundation for science communication, for having the kind of conversations we're having here. Otherwise, it's just anecdotes. We're trying to build that evidence base so that we can make better decisions, make the best possible decisions for fish, for the environment, things that benefit anglers and fisheries management and so on.
Yeah, I read one that you were a part of not too long ago. I think it might have been one that you primarily published, where it was about that information gap between like researchers and, the actual fisheries managers that are out in the field. And, this just, I guess, kind of bubble that exists between those two and trying to break that down. So yeah, if you go and look at all of your research, it varies quite a bit. I mean, a little bit of everything that you've been a part of, over the past, I'm assuming probably a decade, 2 decades, probably at this point.
Yeah. And it goes back to that, fishing, I think most anglers are curious people, and being an angler and a scientist and being curious, it's hard to say no. Hey, we've got a problem over here. Can you help us solve it? And it involves this species or this issue. It's sort of, I immediately throw my fishery science detective hat on and I'm like, heck yeah, let's do this. I'm going to learn something. So that's the other thing. I really like learning, and I like learning by doing. And with science, you don't know the answer. You never know what the answer is until you do it. You can guess, you can have preconceived notions as to how you think the world works, but science is such and fish are such that we get tricked. And that parlays nicely into what we're going to talk about today.
Yes, it does. So that actually brings us perfectly to one of the reasons, and probably the main reason I reached out and, wanted to have you on the show, was I came across one of your 1,400 research papers that were on that website, but one of them specifically stood out to me, and it actually comes from a question that we had written into our mailbag, and I was researching some answers to that type of thing, and one of the things that came up was an article on ResearchGate, and it was from 2020, and it was titled, "Do Carbonated Beverages Reduce Bleeding from Gill Injuries in Angled Northern Pike?" And that stuck out to me like a sore thumb because, again, as like just a normal, kind of rednecky dude in Ohio, a lot of those papers and those research projects kind of go over my head a little bit when I read the titles at first. And you really have to sit there and think about it. You're like, all right, what are they trying to do here? And I have to spend a lot more time. This one smacked me in the face and was like, this is a question you've had forever and you've heard 12 different answers to, and why Papaw said that it worked or didn't work. So it really piqued my interest, and I read the abstract of it, and I immediately looked you up and wanted to see if you'd come on the show to talk about it. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is that phenomenon or wives' tale, or maybe some truth to it, on whether or not carbonated beverages of any sort should be poured on a bleeding fish, and if it helps stop and helps that fish have a better chance of survival. So I guess to start out with, how does a project like this come about? I know you mentioned, like, one, it's just intellectual curiosity with a lot of this stuff, but for this specific research project, was there a catalyst that said, hey, let's go down this road and try and prove or not prove this?
So one of the things I do is subscribe to lots of different fishing magazines and spend time on Facebook sites and taking in podcasts and webinars and so on, trying to, figure out, take a pulse on the community, what's going on. And the, kept coming up, this idea that Mountain Dew in particular had some gift, some special properties that could stop bleeding. And that sort of aligned with, I went fishing with a local fishing guide, John Anderson, who's a muskie nut, catches massive muskie each year. And he invited myself and a colleague out fishing for a day. And he said, you know what? It's like, I'd like to fund this. And, not thousands and thousands of dollars, but it's like, I take a little bit of my lure set. He also makes these incredible muskie spinners. He's like, I want to, basically take $5 from all these sales and all my guiding, and it adds up, and here's a couple $1,000, and will that help? And I'm like, that's enough to get this going. We can make this happen. I can bring boats, and I've got some students, and I don't think we have to do anything super fancy in terms of technology here. So John certainly pushed us to do it. And I'll say from the beginning, John is a muskie angler and is convinced it worked. So he definitely was just like, this is gonna be great. This is gonna demonstrate scientifically what I observe when I go fishing.
So why was it northern pike that you guys decided to pursue for this study versus, I mean, if it was a muskie guy going out, maybe there's a little bit of like, okay, we don't want to go rip the gills of muskie. I get that. That's definitely, as a muskie angler too, I understand that completely. But was that the reason why you went down the northern pike route versus even like smallmouth, largemouth, walleye, things like that?
It was trying to come up with something that was relevant to muskie, given that muskie anglers had funded it. Yes, we didn't want to injure a bunch of muskie, but it was also the fact that it would have cost an awful lot of money, a lot of time on the water. I know we go on weekends and we don't get paid, but I have to pay people that are working for me to go fishing, and it hurts when they have, like, oh, we got none this week, but I still get to pay you. So
pike are a little easier to grab a big sample size of than elusive muskie.
We can catch 20 or 30 a day, and one of the lakes we work on, they're all hammer handles. They're all exactly the same length. They're somewhere around 2.5 feet long. They're all almost identical in size, and like I said, we can catch 20 or 30 easily in a morning, and then we got tons of animals to work with.
So to me, like, that is like the last fish that I think I would want to catch and mess with their gills and around their mouth and everything. You've got these just full of pea and vinegar snot rockets that are out there, and they've got razor sharp everything all over the place. Did you guys have any sort of cuts or casualties where a couple of them got you as you were trying to do this research?
Yeah, nothing major though. Again, these aren't trophy fish that'll take your finger and send you running for stitches. So yeah, and they're also the size that a good death grip behind the gills, and you sort of can control them. And yes, you do get covered in fish slime, of course.
Which pike slime is gross anyway.
Oh yeah.
So as far as catching the pike themselves, I know you mentioned that they were all angled. You didn't do any sort of shocking for these fish. It was all line and lure taken normally. So then you catch these fish. I'm assuming, obviously, you're not catching the fish and they're coming in with the gill injury that you're trying to replicate with all of these. So I think the article said something like, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was like experimentally injuring, these fish or whatever it may be. How are you doing that? Is it a puncture wound? Is it more of a rip? How are you trying to replicate what, Mr. Anderson and these people were seeing in these gill injuries?
Yeah. And so with science, we wanted to be able to have something that others could replicate if they wanted. When you catch a fish and their gills are injured, it might be 3 filaments, it might be 10, it might be on the first gill arch, it might be on the third gill arch, it might be a quarter inch of damage, a quarter square inch of damage, it might be 2 square inches of damage. And so what we wanted to do is take away that. We wanted the exercise component of the angling. So we caught fish, any fish that was deeply hooked. And the way we were fishing, it was mostly chatterbaits and jerk. We didn't get a lot of deep hooking, frankly, especially that size class. They aren't inhaling them too badly. So in fact, we let fish go if they did have any bleeding. Just to, again, we wanted them all to be the same, angled, exercise. They all fight for about 20 seconds. They fight, they thrash for about the first 10 seconds, and it's just dead weight, bringing them in. And then we brought them on board, put them in, and then we used end cutting pliers. Also, bigger ones are known as linesman's pliers, but they allowed us to take 1 centimeter, which is, I don't know, about just under half an inch of tissue. And we took it off the same gill arch in the same side of the fish. And we did do a number of trials ahead of time. We didn't just lock in. We wanted bleeding, but we also didn't want them all to bleed to death, so that it was it was finding that sweet spot. How much is too much? So there was some trial and error, working with vets, I should say. We can't just go randomly around damaging animals. We have animal care protocol. So working back and forth with the vets to make sure that whatever we were doing was sort of in that sweet spot to be relevant, but not unnecessarily harm fish.
What's next after you catch these fish and you use the lineman cutters right there and you cut out that small piece? Is it immediately to the, kind of array of carbonated beverages that you have there? And, okay, first fish is going to be, I think you guys did Pepsi, Mountain Dew, and then I think I read carbonated lake water, which I'm not quite sure how you do that. I'm interested to hear that in a second versus just regular like carbonated water you get at the store or whatever. But is it just going through and, okay, I need 3 fish because I need to do first round of these, another 3 fish second round? How'd you guys go about applying the carbonated beverage?
Yeah. So the very first thing when the fish came on board, they'd get randomly allocated to one of the treatments. We also had control fish where they weren't bled and where nothing was poured on them. They weren't injured. We had fish that were injured, but were just put in water and so on. But the very first thing we did was we had a whole color palette. And we compared the color of the gills to our color palette, and they were ordered. I think we had about 20 different color options. And the darker the gills would indicate a fish that had lots of red blood cells, it hadn't bled out any. And sure enough, the fish had quite dark gills at that point in time. We were able to see, it was red number 6 or whatever on this scale. And then we did the injury. And then a period of time, we would then put them in a cooler, a white cooler with clear water. And that's important. It's lake water, but we could see in it. And it was a white cooler, which allowed us to look for puffs of blood or evidence of bleeding. And then we would watch that. We would revisit them and check gill color. We would do reflexes. So can the fish keep itself upright or is it leaning to the side? If you try and grab it, does it try and get away from you or does it just sit there like a log, which pike don't do? They want to get away from you, that kind of thing. So pretty simple. Like I said, nothing high tech. We had to go to the paint store and steal some paint chips. That was sort of and then try to arrange them in an order that made sense relative to gill color. That was the most complicated part.
So how did you choose the types of pop that you were using? Because like I said, I think there were 3. I think when I read the abstract, it was Mountain Dew, Coca-Cola, and then carbonated lake water.
So Mountain Dew is one that you just hear about, see on Facebook. It seems to be the one. Mountain Dew is not easy to find up in Canada.
Really?
Not surprisingly, Walmart is sort of the go-to. I went to all sorts of grocery stores and I was like, you know what? I'm going to check Walmart. And sure enough, Walmart came through for me.
Ohio runs on Mountain Dew. Like that is, it basically comes out of our taps at this point.
Yeah. And then just a standard cola or soda or whatever, depending on where you are in the world, what you call it. But I don't remember whether it was Coke or Pepsi. I think you've probably read it more recently than I have. And then carbonated lake water. So we bought a soda stream so that, people buy those, they can make, like flavored cola or lime water or whatever in their kitchen. And the reason we did that was because some of these beverages really change the chemistry of the water. Yes, it's a liquid, but they have odd pH and all sorts of things in them. So is it the carbonation? So by carbonating the lake water, all we're doing is adding the carbonation to what they're already swimming in. I will note that research accounting, so when we submit receipts, they did not like the SodaStream receipt. And I had to write a small essay on why that was a research purchase. So, yeah.
Did you get to keep the SodaStream afterwards?
It is, after it's had lake water through it.
That's true.
It's still at the field station where we work. And no, nobody's making cola with that.
So I also remember, I think in the paper, it said that you varied the temperatures of those too, right? To try and figure out, does room temperature versus cold, Coke or Mountain Dew or whatever make a difference? So what did you do on the room temperature side versus like cold? Yeah.
So we assumed that if people had cola on board or pop, that they would have it in a cooler. And temperature might matter. And so we wanted to do sort of iced, like out of an ice chest versus not. It was truly room temperature. It's not like we left it baking in the sun and it was, 100 degrees Fahrenheit or anything like that. But it was just in the shade, in the boat, sort of at, probably, what's room temperature, 71, 72 degrees, somewhere around there. So for anybody that's wondering why I'm struggling with temperature, I'm a Celsius guy.
Yeah.
Science uses Celsius, and being Canadian, it's also Celsius. So I'm having to do some quick mental math here. So.
Yeah, before we started recording, I asked him how the weather was up there, and he gave me it in Celsius, and I was like, that means absolutely nothing to me. All right, everybody, we'll get back to Dr. Stephen Cooke in just a second, but first, we are brought to you in part by Dakota Lithium Batteries. You guys know by now, everything that I have out on the water that requires juice out there, I use Dakota Lithium Batteries for. I've ran them for years at this point, and I can tell you I've never had a Dakota Lithium battery fail me when I needed it most. I put these darn things through the ringer all the time in my kayak, whether it's for my electronics, for my motor. They're exposed to the elements. I'm taking them in and out of the kayak. They're getting dirty, they're getting muddy, they're exposed to the rain. It doesn't matter. They perform every single time I need them to. Not only that, Dakota Lithium batteries are also twice the power of traditional batteries. They're half the weight. They charge up to 5 times faster. They last up to 4 times longer. They've got 100% US-based customer support, and they come with a whopping 11-year warranty. That means your battery is going to be in like middle school. It's going to be like in 6th grade before it runs out of warranty. Protect your investment. Go with the company that stands behind their products. That's exactly what Dakota Lithium does. And as always, you can go over to dakotalithium.com and use code TACKLETALK5. Not only does it let them know that we sent you, it saves you 5% on your next battery purchase. And with batteries, that adds up quick. So again, it's code TACKLETALK5 over at www.dakotalithium.com, the official lithium battery of Bassmaster. So then the one thing that's impressive, though, is the amount of variables you guys took into consideration in this. It was not just let's get a couple bleeding fish, pull some pop on it, and say yes or no that it works. So one of the other variables you guys did was, I think, the temperature of the actual water. So like the seasonality, and trying to replicate that and say, okay, well, does it make a difference? Could it be that these fish in warmer water, it works for them, and in colder water, it doesn't, or vice versa, or whatever. So how did you do that? Did you have to do this study at different times of year and replicate it like in the spring versus summer, or did you change the actual temperature of the water on board the boat, or what did you guys do?
Yeah, we took advantage of natural variation in water temperature and the fact that we can catch so many pike so quickly. So if, water temperature, we started in the spring and we did it when temperatures, and you can kind of look at the weather and be like, okay, things are going to be stable more or less, a degree in either direction. Celsius in either direction, over this coming week. So we're going to do it now, and then we'll wait till things go up and then stabilize, and then we get our second temperature. That wouldn't work if we were working on muskie, right? And you'd catch, a fish a week. Well, each week it would go up a degree or 2 or 3 or 4, and eventually you'd have the stable summer temps and lots at the warm temp. So it was partly the fact that we could catch so many pike allowed us to do the 2 temps. I'm not sure I'm trying to remember whether our goal was initially to do 2 temperatures or we did it the cold, and for reasons we will talk about later, I don't want to give away the spoiler. We decided we wanted to do it again to make sure we weren't missing anything. And so we just waited and tried to do it at a temperature where pike are cool water fish. And so where it was pushing them a little bit more. And the reason temperature matters for something like a study like this is blood pressure, blood viscosity, all of those things change with temperature. A couple degrees means a lot for a fish. We call temperature the master factor. It affects everything from digestive enzymes, how much energy they need, how fast their heart beats, and so on. So it's a logical thing to consider.
So then it takes us to the fun part of this that you hinted at a second ago. What were the findings of this study? Like when the dust settles, you have all these different variables that you've tested these fish. What did you guys end up finding?
Okay, so the take-home message is that we saw no benefit or disbenefit, I think that's also important, of using any of the carbonated beverages. So they did not increase the speed at which fish clotted. They did not, we measured by looking at clotting. We measured by looking at the change in gill color. We looked at their reflexes, those kinds of things. So no difference. And it didn't matter across the 2 temperatures or whether we use cold soda or warm soda. Nothing mattered. Okay. But we did see some things that I think are really fascinating. And I mentioned at the beginning this idea that, I think we were being tricked. And here's how. And we used a white cooler, and I highlighted that white cooler, clear water, so we could see those puffs of blood. So when a human goes near a fish, when a fish is stressed, like when you first stress it, the first thing that happens is they sort of hold their breath. It's called a bradycardia, and that's a fancy medical word or anatomy word for the heart stops. So literally they freeze, they stop, because they're like, wow, something's going on here. I don't like it. I'm just going to stop. And in the case of what we did, we think it was the soda being poured, or pop being poured over their gills, which to a pike is a noxious substance, right? It's not what they're used to. It's what's all this bubbly stuff, and maybe it stings, maybe it doesn't, but it's different. And their gills are, immediately respond, signal the heart to pause. And there's a lot of sensory apparatus on the gills. So they immediately pause, right? So they don't want to be pumping blood through the gills when there's weird stuff bathing the gills. And so that bradycardia stays there for a while. So the fish continues to hold its breath for about 15 seconds. So you pour the stuff over, you've got the fish, you're hanging them over the side of the boat. You're like, yep, looks like they stopped bleeding because they've stopped pumping their heart. There's no blood coming out, right? And so you put them in a white cooler and you look and you're like, yes, 15 seconds, still no bleeding. But then all of a sudden there'd be one puff of blood. And that would be, and then there'd be about 10 seconds later, there'd be another puff. And then 5 seconds later, there'd be another puff. And then 3 seconds, 2 seconds, one, as their heart starts to ramp up again. And this takes, 30 seconds to a minute for them to get back to their usual of, a pike at those temperatures, probably 50, 60, 80 beats a minute, somewhere in there, especially because we just angled them as well. And when their hearts go, all of a sudden, all the blood starts pumping. So essentially, for the short term, it gives the illusion that the fish are not bleeding, that it worked. But if you hold it in a white cooler and watch it, you will watch that fish bleed in front of your very eyes. But a fish, if you put that pike overboard, you can't hold on to it. It's taken off after 15, 20 seconds, and it's going to go bleed over in that weed bed, and you're going to feel really good about what you did, how you saved the life of that pike. Like I said, and importantly, there was no disbenefit. It was a wash as to whether you used plain water or carbonated water, or so it's not like it made it worse, but it didn't make it better. And so the only loss, really, the negative, is you've wasted $1.
Precious elixir of the gods, Mountain Dew, you have poured on the ground.
Yeah, you're thirsty now. So and it's possible. We didn't do this work. I'm not a gill physiologist. We didn't do histology work where you throw it under a microscope and look at, was the gill tissue actually damaged by that, again, noxious substance? It is a chemical, like it or not, we drink chemicals.
Right.
And for fish, we don't know if it actually causes any damage. But in the short term, we know that there's no benefit. And so, drink your pop.
So that's interesting. So visually, it makes a little bit of sense why over decades and decades we have thought that maybe this works, and why people will swear up and down that they've seen it work 1,000 times, because it is this illusion of it working. But then there's this weird factor of, okay, the way you're explaining this, you're almost putting that fish in like a mini state of shock. You're shocking that gill membrane a little bit. It goes into that, bradycardia, I think you called it. Yep. So I could almost make the argument, maybe that's not the best thing for the fish, right? Because now you have two stressors. You have a gill injury, and you have, I'm going to shock you so bad, you're going to hold your breath for 30 seconds to a minute, and then you're going to let everything out. So again, long-term, who knows? Who knows if delayed mortality, if that makes a difference in it or not. But I guess the point is, it sounds like a very unnecessary thing to do to that fish to give yourself a false sense of security that you helped it and let it go.
Yeah. Air exposure will also cause bradycardia. Just so you can just air expose a fish and they do the same thing. They're like, whoa, because they can't extract oxygen from the air. So there are a few. It's not just pouring cola that causes bradycardia.
Just exasperate it a little bit, maybe.
An osprey flies overhead. Same thing. I've done work where we've flown in a lab where we were measuring their heart rate. We flew fake osprey overhead, and we had a heron head that would dip in, and same thing. They would when the osprey flew overhead, they would just totally freeze. You can't see me, my heart's not beating. But yeah.
So what about the difference between all of your research was on the gills? So one of the other places that, fish get super gut hooked too is almost like that deep tongue patch that they'll get in the middle of their mouth. Do you think it's fairly similar all the way around where there's no difference in an injury to the gill versus an injury maybe to the gullet right there? This is pretty universal that we can kind of say this doesn't do anything no matter where it's hooked.
Yeah, it's consistent. I don't think hooking location matters a whole lot. If there's bleeding, I can't imagine that it works in one place and not another. The single biggest determinant of whether or not a fish survives a catch and release event is where it's hooked.
Yeah.
And obviously some fish are more sensitive than others. If you catch a brook trout in the gill and, it loses 1 milliliter of blood, it's probably dead. Whereas there's other fish, pike are sort of somewhere in the middle of the road in terms of being robust. And then you can imagine things like a bullhead catfish or a carp or something at that extreme where you can kind of drag them behind a car and then they'll swim away still. So, yeah.
So again, for folks at home that are listening, we're going to reiterate this a little bit. The study found that there was no measurable difference in the amount of bleeding or the length of time bleeding of a fish by applying carbonated beverages versus not applying carbonated beverages. And that was with northern pike. Now here's, $1 million question too. Do you think that there's enough similarity between a northern pike and a smallmouth bass, a northern pike and a walleye to say that this is probably universal?
Yeah. And I will say there's no other published study out there on this. And there are 30,000 plus species of fish. Obviously, we don't catch, we don't fish for whale shark. We don't fish for pygmy seahorse and so on. But, of the IGFA, for example, I think it's 800 or so species that they keep track of that we angle. Does this apply across all of those, given the diversity that we have out there? Who knows? What is universal is fish having a physiological response to a noxious substance put on their gills, because that's how they're sensing their environment. Fish are very good at measuring temperature, measuring oxygen. There's more oxygen over here than there is over there, so I'm going that way. So the fact that their gills are sensitive shouldn't surprise anybody. Our lungs are sensitive. If smoke goes in our lungs, we cough. If you are in a house fire and inhale a lot of smoke, you're unfortunately probably going to pass away. It's lungs. Lungs are important, and in many ways, the gills are that lung tissue for a fish. So we are planning on doing some work this coming year, next summer, on bass. And I can't tell you whether we're going to do smallmouth, largemouth, or both. And we'll likely include a soda treatment or a pop treatment, but we're also going to look at some of these products that you can now buy that make claims that, they're a little spray bottle that, you can buy at tackle shops that might be, anywhere from $10 to $30. And you can spray them on the gills and they make claims that they stop bleeding and so on. When we do this work, and I know we identified Mountain Dew and Cooke, I wasn't worried about them getting sued or us getting sued, because that's not the primary purpose of the drain.
You're not dismantling a claim that they're making.
Yeah.
It's a claim that we make as anglers.
Yeah. But we did some work this past year looking at live well additives. We didn't name and shame, and so we'll do the same where we'll be like, we tested 3 commercially available and here's what we found, and we'll, whatever it is, or if there's one that shines and is really good, maybe we'll talk to our lawyers and decide whether we want to share that name. But that's the one challenge with all fish care products. Unless there's something that a vet orders, they aren't right. It's not regulated. So literally, you put food coloring in a bottle and make any claims you want. It could be different every time and so on. So we're cautiously optimistic. There's 3 or 4 products out there now. So unless it's true, somebody's truly trying to screw everybody over, one would hope that they've done some kind of work, but if they've done work, it's proprietary. They haven't shared it. So forcing us to do this. So we're going to do that. And I'll tell you what we find.
Well, unfortunately, in the fishing world, their research could have been, I sprayed it on this fish and I saw it stop bleeding for 30 seconds and let it go. So put it on the market, maybe. Let's go.
Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to, I would say, for anglers that are going out fishing from here on out, probably the biggest question that should be answered. And this lines up perfectly with the initial question that came through to our mailbag powered by Dakota Lithium. This was probably maybe 2 months ago at this point. And the question was essentially, I've caught this bleeding fish. What should I do? I've been told that Mountain Dew works. I've been told, to do this or to do that or let it go as soon as possible or whatever. And they're looking for the answer of, for the best case scenario to give the fish the best chance to live. Some fish are just going to be beyond hope. That's just unfortunately part of angling. Accidents are going to happen. It's just a matter of you're not going out there trying to mutilate fish every day, right? It's just a necessary evil of the sport. But if you do catch a fish and you do injure, a piece of the gill or something and it is bleeding, from your standpoint, what should somebody do?
I'm going to take you back a step, first of all, and think about hook removal. So the first thing is, if a fish is hooked in a place where, whether that be in the gullet or throat or esophagus, whatever you want to call it, in the tongue deep enough where you think it might be into the vasculature, into the blood vessels and arteries, or in the gills, the first thing I do is, if it's just a single hook, cut the line and be, if it was a Texas rigged worm or something like that, just cut the line and be done with it. We know that that's way better than trying to remove the hook. And if it's a treble hook or something like that, a jerk bait that's in the, in the gills of a pike, immediately I pull out my bolt cutters. And so I've got mini bolt cutters that work. That aren't a rusted mess. And it's as much for safety for me and my kids and friends as it is for the fish. But you pull them out and it just effortlessly cut those off. I got to replace a hook or maybe even an entire lure if I demo it. But that fish is less likely to bleed out, and it gives time for it to sort of clod around it and for the fish to work it out at its own pace. And we know that that's better for fish. Fish survival rates are always higher when deeply hooked fish, where you cut the line and leave the hook in place, than removing it. So that's step one. And similarly, if you're fishing and catching all sorts of fish in bad places, adjust what you're doing. You can put a single hook, a Siwash hook or something on the back of a jerkbait if they're taking it deeply. If you're fishing a spinnerbait or that has a trailer hook, remove the trailer hook, put a bigger piece of plastic on there that'll reduce the likelihood that they end up with it too deeply. So there's little adjustments you can make there too. And then, of course, despite all of that, you've got a fish that's still bleeding. I am a proponent of getting the fish back into the water as quickly as possible. But if it's a fish that is legally harvestable and has a high likelihood of dying, I don't want to waste that flesh. So I will throw it in a live well or a cooler. I will nurse it over the side of the boat and maybe hold it, even though it's trying to get away from me. I might hold it a little bit longer. And I'm watching for things like gill color. At some point, if the gills are pale, sure, it might still be technically alive, but it's on its way out. If it's eye locks, when you see a fish and its eye, that's another one. They don't come back from that ever. You can give them as much CPR as you want. They're toast. If they lose fin color, they don't come back. That's just the same as, in humans in an accident, your blood goes to your core because, you don't need to be doing this. You need to be worrying about breathing and brain function and so on. So those are signs. Again, it has to be legal. If it's illegal, then, if it's not a fish you can legally harvest, then so be it. It goes back. If it dies, it's fertilizer. But reflect on it and learn and be like, okay, what could I have done differently? And sometimes there's nothing. It's, I moved to British Columbia to work on salmon for my postdoc. I did my PhD at the University of Illinois, and I needed some topography in my life. I needed some ocean and some mountains. So I went to BC to work on salmon. And the very first fish I caught, I've got a picture of it. It's a little rainbow trout, about 9-10 inches long, and the thing bled out in my hands. I was like, oh my God. And even then I'd published a lot. I'm like, wow, I'm this expert apparently on catch and release. And the first salmonid I catch in British Columbia, I annihilate. So it does happen, and it's unavoidable in some instances, but just by chance, it's But when you start to see a pattern, when you're like, wow, every third fish is deeply hooked, every third fish is bleeding, that's where you change your behavior, and that means thinking about hooks, thinking about gear, maybe a bigger lure. If they're inhaling that crankbait, I'm going to go up a couple sizes so that they can only nip at the tail or the underside. They can get the hook, but not the whole thing. It's cheaper too.
Yeah, there's a couple interesting things there. First, I like what you said about the almost like physiological signs of a dying fish. And I think that's important for some people to realize too, is we hear it all the time. Just because a fish swims away, that fish is not good, right? That fish is kind of fight or flight, and then give it an hour, give it 12 hours, whatever, that fish could die. One of the things that you mentioned was the eye lock, and that's something that I've used my entire life, was especially with smallmouth. Smallmouth, if a smallmouth is going to die, the eyes, it's not like you're not waiting for the eyes to, the pupil to separate from the rest of the white and they have that classic dead eye look, but the eyes will stop darting. They'll stop trying to look the other way, and they will just look one direction. They'll still look fine, colors fine, the rest of the fish can be fine, the gills are moving, everything. As soon as those eyes completely stop trying to dart and look around, you know that there's some trouble. Either you had that fish out of the water too long, I've seen people do that, and that starts to have an issue, where it was hooked, things like that. Yeah, it's even almost like sometimes if you fight those fish for so long, muskie and pike are a really good example. That lactic acid builds up and you see that those kind of eyes stop and you're just like, oh no, this fish needs to be nursed a little bit. So good stuff there. Also good stuff on just the common sense angling of if your fish are choking that bait. If you've caught 3 fish in a row on a 110 size jerkbait and all of them have been in the back of the throat and you've killed 3 fish in a row, like you said, maybe switch to a single hook. You don't need the trebles. They're eating it just fine. So, or just put the trebles on the front, maybe the front 1 or the front 2. If it's got 3, have the back stinger just be a single hook. That type of thing is really important. I think a lot of times we just get it in our heads. Nope, a 110 jerkbait's going to have 3 trebles on it. That's just how it works. It's like, well, if they're eating it that good, you can make some adjustments and you'll be fine. When you cut a hook and a hook stays in a fish, you said, I think what you mentioned there was called working it out. So how does that work? Does it realize there's a foreign thing there that needs to be taken care of and pushed to the outer part of the skin, or does it just stay there forever and eventually hopefully disintegrate? How does that work?
So we're using, of course, like fancy hooks these days. We're not using, like bronze, like hooks that break down and, so they're all fancy, chemically sharpened, boron, titanium, this stuff isn't breaking down quickly, but fish are able to move things along, especially if it's in the esophagus. That's where it's really dangerous to fish around and try and get a hook out, because that's where just, north of the esophagus is, you've got heart back there, you've got liver, you've got important vessels. So it's just best to let it move it out at its own pace. We've done some studies with bluegill where we include different lengths of fishing line on it. So we can keep track of, the one that's a 1/4 inch long was in fish number 2. And the one that's, or we'll put little marks in the hook with a Dremel tool so that we can identify hooks and link that back to individual fish and where they were hooked and how long it takes to move them out. And I'm trying to think off the top of my head, bluegill, it was by day 10, 40-50% of the fish had gotten rid of those hooks, and they'd all come
like pooping it out, like it's going through the entire fish.
Through the back
That's
end.
Amazing.
So, and way almost negligible mortality relative to when you fish around and try and get them out. You do a lot of damage in there. And yes, like, oh, I don't want that fish to swim away with that hook. It can't be bad for him. Again, it's kind of like, those rescue shows where there's always somebody like impaled on a fence post, and they bring them to the hospital they cut off the fence post and bring them to the hospital with that in place, as opposed to ripping it out and then having them bleed out in the in the ambulance. It's kind of the same thing, and let clotting, coagulation happen around it. It may, in fact, that gill arch may become, if it's in a gill arch, it may become non-functional, and that's fine, but it's better than ripping it out where we don't have a Band-Aid we can apply, right? Unfortunately, the pop doesn't work. I'm unsure about some of these other sprays. We need to study those, but we can't literally put a Band-Aid on. Putting pressure on really doesn't work. We do that when we bleed. We take blood samples from fish, and we do it from their tail. So we'll flip them over in the underside of the tail, and sometimes when we do that, they'll continue to bleed when we take out the needle. And, we put our finger on it. It does not, I think we do it because it feels like the right thing to do, but it's just the odd one will bleed, and it just, it's just a matter of time for it to coagulate. Putting our fish, it's not like a human where you put pressure on and it's just, their blood is different. And they need to be in water. So there's that too.
That's all interesting stuff, and stuff that is applicable to, us that are going to go out this weekend and run into some of these situations. So we appreciate that. Obviously, you heard it straight from him. Stop wasting your Mountain Dew. Stop pouring them on these fish. There's no scientific reason to be doing it. If anything, it fools you into kind of shocking the fish for a second. It makes you feel a little better, and you put that fish back, and it did nothing except waste your drink. So that's very interesting, and we appreciate you sharing that. Before we let you go here, this is just one of hundreds and hundreds of projects you've obviously been a part of. I mean, some of the ones I saw were like, if it was activity levels of channel cats, it was cardiovascular performance of sunfish during the spawn, and, sockeye salmon migration and things like that. If someone listens to this, and there are going to be people that are intellectually curious like I am and listen to this and say, you know what, some of that sounds like a lot more interesting stuff to go seek out and read than the people complaining about forward-facing sonar for the, 10th week in a row in the bass fishing community, and I'd like to read something constructive. Where do you recommend folks go? Where can people keep up with the research that you're doing? I use ResearchGate. I know there's multiple places, and some places have like almost like not a paywall, but you have to be a researcher to access them, versus others are for the public. Where should folks go?
Yeah, our lab website, we put everything on there for free. Unless somebody comes after us for copyright law, it's all on there because, if the science isn't shared, then why do it? If it's not accessible, why do it? So I just sort of give the finger to the big publishers, and I've only gotten in trouble once or twice. Only had to pay a few $1,000 in fines. It's there for folks to access. And that's www.fecpl.ca. So, and you can click on publications. We've got a forward-facing sonar paper, a science take, a review of it that was just accepted. I think Bass took a nice, moderate, a reasonable approach. But
it was just stopping the arms race is really what you're trying to do at this point.
Yep, and create opportunity for. I like how they're going to mix it up with different water bodies where forward-facing sonar in the slop ain't going to do any good for you other than accumulate more weeds. So I like thinking carefully about site choice and all of that. So it was a really moderate choice. The take home on science of forward-facing sonar. Most instances we don't know enough to really make any statements. I worry a little bit about there's some unique situations. Paddlefish snagging, it makes it awfully efficient.
Yep.
And paddlefish are cool and unique, and that might be one to keep an eye on. But there's some equity issues. Only if only the 1% can afford it. What does that mean? But these aren't fisheries management questions. These are societal questions, and no different than AI or cell phones or Teslas. So, yeah.
Yeah, like my take on that is until state organizations decide to, use air quotes here, like ban it or something, then even if tournament trails have their own rules, your weekend warrior, I can still go out there and use it. So nothing's going to change. So unless people, like you are going to have papers that are going to come out in the next 5-10 years as this technology gets more readily available to more and more people, and we're going to learn more about it. And then there will probably be some policy changes that I think it's probably more on, the DNR and people like that to say what's sporting, what's not sporting, and then that trickles down to, obviously us as anglers. But there's all kinds of stuff. You guys have all these cool papers and different topics that you have gone down the road already, a lot more on the horizon. So I do encourage folks to check it out. I'll put the link in the show description to the website so that folks can click on it and look at all of your research. But, Dr. Stephen Cooke, thank you so much for stopping by today. We appreciate your time so much, and hopefully look forward to talking to you again down the road. We appreciate it.
Let's make it happen. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody, that's our episode today with Dr. Stephen Cooke. I hope you guys all learned something today, whether Dr. Cooke's findings proved what you already thought to be true, or if it opened your eyes a little bit and showed you that some things aren't always as they seem. But either way, I do hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember, stop wasting your soda. It's not actually helping the fish, even if it's just giving you the illusion for a few seconds that it is. The science says otherwise. And with that, we thank you so much for tuning in today. As always, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts. Find us on the web, www.tackletalkpodcast.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Tackle Talk Podcast. We'll see you right back here next Tuesday for another brand new episode of Tackle Talk.